guys. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We're really excited to be here. So I'm Samantha, and I'm a third-year graduate student at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and I study tuberculosis.
And I'm Francesca, and I'm a second-year PhD student at the Harvard Chan School, and I also study tuberculosis.
So we're lab mates, and we're really excited to be here today to talk to you a little bit about this cool topic of extremophiles, life on the edge of our planet. So this beautiful graphic, as was designed by our graphic designer, kind of gives a little hint into some of the things we'll talk about. So we'll talk about some microorganisms that live in some extreme parts of the Earth and try and put that in the context of whether or not life can exist on Mars. And so to get us started, we're just going to kind of outline a little bit about our project and what we're going to talk to you about today. And so we're going to talk to you about life on Mars. So we'll start off with a little bit of a different spin from E.T. and other movies about extraterrestrial life. So we're going to tell you about real-life organisms that live here on Earth and that we could learn from them about what it would possibly take to live on Mars. So in order to do this, we're first going to walk you through a comparison of Mars and Earth and tell you a bit about how these planets differ and why we see so much life here on Earth, but not possibly found any yet on Mars. And so after that, we'll come back to Earth and talk about environments that are pretty similar to Mars. And it turns out that there actually are some things living in these crazy places of Earth. So after that, we're going to move into the next section of our talk where we're going to really address the title of our talk, which is Extremophiles. And so we're going to walk you through exactly what it means to be an extremophile and tell you a little bit more about where they live and how they live. So we've picked a couple of our favorite extremophiles that we're going to highlight, and we'll dive into their day-to-day life. And then for the last part of the talk, we're going to let you guys tell us which extremophile that we presented you think is likely to survive on Mars, given what we've learned. And so with that, we're going to start off with the first section of our talk, talking about Mars versus Earth.
All right, so I don't remember a time in my life when people weren't asking the question, can humans live on Mars? Of all the planets in the solar system, Mars has kind of invoked the most interest for human settlement for as long as we can remember. And that's because the general consensus is that Mars is the next best thing that we have to Earth. For one, it contains soil that has water that we could potentially extract. It's not too hot, it's also not too cold. Gravity on Mars is about 38% of that on Earth, making it kind of more possible for our bodies to adapt to it. And it has an atmosphere that offers protection from the sun's radiation. Also, the day-night life cycle is about 24 hours, 39 minutes, and 35 seconds, making it pretty similar to Earth. So this kind of tells you that Mars might be a pretty good place for human settlement, but don't pack your bags just yet, because Mars is the closest thing we have to Earth. But close is a very relative term when you actually crunch the numbers. So the soil that I've mentioned that we'd love to farm is actually a carpet of toxic chemicals. Multiple different NASA probes have identified levels of perchlorates in the soil that would be dangerous to humans. And so on Earth, we know these chemicals, perchlorates, as the components of rocket fuels and fireworks. So imagine breathing that all the time. Also, Mars is very, very cold. It's just not as cold as, say, Saturn or Neptune. Mars is 50% farther away from the sun than Earth is, making it harder to get heat. And although the red planet has an atmosphere, it's about 100 times thinner than Earth's, making it harder to retain heat. So average temperatures hover around minus 60 degrees Celsius, and coming from Chicago, that's pretty close to what we've had, but still a lot colder. And then they dip down to minus 125 degrees in the winter. So like we said, Mars has an atmosphere, even though it's kind of thin. So it provides protection from some solar radiation, but not all. So humans on Earth are exposed to, on average, 0.62 rads per year. That's just a unit of radiation. Whereas someone working in a nuclear power plant, for instance, is really not allowed to be exposed to more than 8 times that value, so about 5 rads per year. But if you're a person living on Mars, on the surface, you would expect, on average, to be exposed to about 20 rads, which is equivalent to about 100 chest CT scans every year. So the list kind of goes on, but suffice to say that if we as humans ever want to live on Mars, we need to bring more than just our suitcases. Okay, so humans aren't the best right now for immediate life on Mars, but what about something else? So For decades, as you can see from these headlines, scientists have been working on ways to probe for life on Mars. And even though we just spent a couple seconds showing you guys why Mars is such a horrible environment for humans, there are reasons to believe that this planet was once a lot more hospitable. And so we still don't know whether there is or was any life on Mars, but when we think about what life on Mars would look like in an effort to develop the kinds of tools to probe for it, we don't actually have to look beyond our own planet Earth to begin answering this question. So the question instead becomes, can other organisms live on Mars? So the reason we can look to life on Earth to help us understand this is that Earth itself has some pretty crazy environments. We have deep sea vents. So these are kind of at the bottom of the ocean. They're super hot, 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and they have a ton of pressure. We have the hot springs, which Sam will tell you about soon, which are highly acidic and also boiling hot. And then in the Pacific Ocean, we have the Mariana Trench, which is the deepest point on our planet and has even higher pressures. And my personal favorite, the Mcmurdo dry valleys of Antarctica, which are one of the driest places on Earth. So these are all places where the average organism on Earth would die. They could not survive there. But what's shocking is that in all of these very extreme environments, there is life. So thanks to billions and billions of years of evolution, different forms of life were able to figure out a way to survive in every pocket of the planet. So if Earth had this kind of chance, could Mars too?
That's okay. So with that, we're going to move into kind of transitioning into this idea. So now we know there's some kind of really extreme environments that exist on Earth. And the question becomes, what are these extremophiles? Are there organisms that actually live in these places? And so extremophiles, by definition, are microorganisms, which are defined as just very, very tiny living organisms that live in conditions of either extreme temperatures or chemical levels. And so it's kind of defined in the word itself. And so if we were to just break the word apart into its different subparts, we can see that there's two basic components to this word. So the first one, extremo, meaning extreme, and the second word, phile, meaning loving. So in this context, the word extremophile really means extreme loving. And so there's different kinds of extremophiles, and I just kind of want to highlight to you that there's the fact that there's this range of extremophiles. So it doesn't necessarily mean just on the higher end of the spectrum or just on the lower end of the spectrum, but really that it encompasses a spectrum and that it can cover anywhere from the lows to the highs. And so what I'm showing you here is just a graph that shows extremophiles in the context of temperature. And so there are some extremophiles that really love cold temperature. And so if we were to look at this graph here, we can see on the y-axis that we're looking at growth rate. And so the higher that the peak of the graph grows, that means that that's the best temperature that these organisms are growing at. And on the x-axis here, what we're looking at is temperature. So one example of an extremophile is a psychrophile, which is a microorganism that grows really well at these low temperatures. So we're talking about 0 to 10 degrees Celsius. We can move our way along this graph, and we can see mesophiles. And so mesophiles are an example of an extremophile that grows at more normal temperatures that we're used to. So about 30 degrees Celsius is where they tend to peak and do well. Continuing to move our way along the graph, we have thermophiles, which are an example of an extremophile moving in the higher temperature direction. So these extremophiles grow well at even higher temperatures here. So we're looking at about 60 to 70 degrees Celsius. And we can continue even higher than that to see hyperthermophiles, which are microorganisms that grow at exceptionally high temperatures. So about the boiling point of water, about 100 degrees Celsius is where they do best. And so the point that I show you here is just really to highlight again that it covers a spectrum. So extremophiles can cover anything from the lows all the way up to the highs. And so before we kind of dive into talking about extremophiles and our specific examples that we have, there's just one point that we really wanted to highlight, and that is that there are three main domains to the classification of life and living organisms. And these three main domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And so we've put some pictures here. I'm sure you guys have heard of bacteria. That's a pretty commonplace word to talk about And so we put some pictures here of some examples that fall into each of these categories. We as humans would fall into the eukarya domain, similar to animals. And so when we talk about microorganisms and extremophiles, we can really be talking about organisms from any of these three classes of domains. And so we're going to kind of highlight as we go through our examples where each of the examples we talk about fits in. But just to kind of keep in that broader spectrum picture in your head, we're not necessarily just talking about bacteria. They could be from any of these classifications of life. And so with that, to just kind of summarize a little bit of background before we head into the diving into our examples of our favorite extremophiles. So Francesca talked a little bit about how Mars is not a hospitable environment to most life on Earth. So there's some pretty extreme conditions in relation to temperature and radiation that would make it really hard for life to live there. However, Earth does have some of these similarities to some of these conditions on Mars. And so we do find some environments on Earth that can be similar to those on Mars that might kind of give us a hint as to how living organisms might survive in these kinds of environments. And also that microorganisms that live in these pockets of Earth are called extremophiles, meaning microorganisms that live within these extreme conditions of Earth. And so with that, we're going to kind of pause for our early question break before we get into kind of the delve of our extremophile examples. But are there any questions before we kind of move into that about any of these environments or Earth or Mars conditions?
Why can mostly small animals survive in these inhospitable environments?
Do you want to take that? Or?
Sure, yeah. So the question was, why can mostly small animals live within these like extreme conditions, which is a great question. So when we get into a little bit more of our examples of some of the extremophiles, so again, we highlighted that there's the three domains of life, which I can go back and click to. So the small animals would fall under this eukarya domain here on the right-hand side. But what we're going to highlight to you in our examples is that there are also examples of extremophiles that fall into these other two domains, so bacteria and archaea. So the real honest answer is that there's not just small animals that live there. There's also other kinds of life that live there. And they all kind of tend to do it a little bit differently. So it's really just about the organisms that have developed mechanisms of which they can withstand these extreme conditions, whether it be temperature or pressure or something of that sort. And so any organism which falls within any of these three domains that's able to develop a pathway that allows it to do that is really what allows it to survive in that condition. Yeah?
So I guess, phrase better, why are all these organisms under all these categories, why do they tend to be small in the extreme conditions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, great question. So the question was kind of why are they so small, like microscopic, in order to survive these conditions? And you'll kind of see this when we go over the specific examples, but the kinds of toolkits that these organisms have evolved, they kind of take up a lot of energy. And so kind of the smaller the organism is, so you have, for instance, a bacterium that is one cell, and you'll see an example where this one cell has 10 copies of its DNA, which we'll talk about. It's kind of very expensive for an organism to be able to support that kind of toolkit. And so in that sense, kind of the fewer cells you have, the smaller you are, the more easily you can hide, the easier it is to maintain yourself. Yes?
What about tardigrades?
We're going to talk about that. That's one of my favorite organisms that we got to. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, so I'll expand on those. And if you have more questions, you can let me know after we're done. Yeah, like thermophile, right? So the question is like the different temperatures. So we're going to kind of touch on that, and we're going to expand when we take the little trip to our lab to talk about that. But there are different tests that you can do in the lab to see whether these organisms do well in high temperatures or low temperatures. But that's a great question. Do you have another one? Yeah.
Last week I was in the Astrophysics Center. There was a chat about the atmosphere and life.
Cool.
So this scientist was more like an astronomic or physicist. He was talking about water bears.
Yeah.
Sending to the space.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk exactly about that. So the water bears and tardigrades are the same organism. It's just like a synonym for each other. So they're called tardigrades or water bears or moss piglets is all their like same names. So we're going to talk about those a little bit later in our example, but that's a great example of space. It's one of my favorites that we'll touch on a little bit later. Any other questions? Yeah.
Some people think that life started because tardigrades flowed onto Earth.
Yeah, I think that could totally, so the question was whether tardigrades came from other places outside in space and landed on Earth. That could totally be a possibility. I think there's a lot of research going on right now to try and answer some of those questions. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit later when we get to the tardigrade section. But I think that's a totally legitimate hypothesis and reason, and scientists don't know. We just don't know the answer yet. So that's a really great idea. Okay, so with that, I think we're going to move into our next section, which is touching a little bit into the day in the life of several extremophiles. So we're going to go through 4 examples of our favorite extremophiles. We're each going to do 2. When we get to the halfway point between after we've covered 2, we'll stop for our like mini break, bathroom break, open it up for questions and stuff, and then we'll continue on with the rest of the presentation. So if you can just hold your questions until we get through the next 2, that would be great.
All right, so I guess the first environment we're going to talk about is a very cold and a very dry place. So this is a bird's eye view right here of what is known as the Mcmurdo dry valleys of Antarctica. And so as you can see, these are kind of a snow-free valley surrounded by snow-capped mountains. And they have very, very low humidity because the surrounding mountains actually prevent the flow of ice from nearby glaciers into the valley. So notice how you can kind of see snow kind of everywhere except for in the actual valleys themselves. And the Mcmurdo Dry Valleys is known as one of the most extreme deserts in the world. And one of the primary concerns when you're living in the desert is desiccation. And this is what makes it nearly impossible to live there. So desiccation is simply a word used to define a state of extreme dryness. So as you guys know, you need water to survive, and you get really thirsty if you go even a couple hours without drinking. So if you live somewhere with absolutely no water, there's no way you would survive for a very long time. And kind of no life on Earth is really an exception to that. And so kind of to nail this point home, I'm going to read you a quote from a book that is about the Mcmurdo Dry Valleys of Antarctica. And it goes, "Nothing moves in the Mcmurdo Dry Valleys of Antarctica. The glaring sun beats down on the rocky troughs that nestle between snow-capped mountains. A footprint can last for decades because it never rains in these valleys. It is one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, yet it could hold the secret to life on other planets." So like I said, no living organisms have really been found living here other than the bacteria that you're about to hear about. So these bacteria are called Coccidiopsis thermalis, or C. thermalis, because it's a bit of a tongue twister, so I'm just going to refer to it as that for the rest of this talk. And these are bacteria that live in rock crevices throughout the valley. So kind of Sam was nailing down how there are these different domains of life, and I just wanted to stress that C. thermalis is a type of bacterium. So this is quartz, and it's one of the types of rock surfaces that C. thermalis like to inhabit. So as you can see, these rocks have cracks and crevices in them that are super dark, and they appear a lot darker than the actual surface of the rock, which is exposed to sunlight. So avoiding direct sunlight helps prevent the desiccation that I mentioned earlier, because all of the sun's really intense energy kind of zaps away any lingering moisture and makes it really hard to live there. C. thermalis strategically live within and underneath these cracks, as shown here, staying away from direct sunlight. And because these cracks are just a little cooler and just a little darker, any moisture that does come their way, such as when glaciers do melt in the summer, it's able to condense and kind of linger longer enough for the bacteria to take it up. So C. thermalis is a type of cyanobacteria. So I just told you they're a type of bacteria, and you can kind of subclassify that into cyanobacteria. And these are organisms that absorb the light from the sun and turn it into energy to stay alive. And then they produce oxygen along the way. So I'm going to pause for a moment to explain to you why light is more than just light and dark, because this will help explain why C. thermalis is so special. So light, as you know, comes from the sun, which is constantly spewing energy in every direction and like little fireballs. The light that we see is part of the sun's energy that our eyes can detect. And when light travels from the sun to the earth, a whole bunch of energy is making that journey. But I just told you that C. thermalis literally live like under rocks. So how could these organisms possibly get enough sunlight to stay alive? So even though it's not immediately obvious, and despite the fact that we usually draw the sun as a big yellow ball, and I'm clearly no exception, sunlight isn't actually a single color. It's what we call white light, and that's just a combination of all the different colors mixed together. And just as a side note, that's why we see a rainbow when drops of water kind of split sunlight into its different components. So all of these colors, as you can see here, have their own energy level associated with them. So kind of the violet and the blues are a higher energy, whereas the orange and the dark red are a lower energy. So when you have cyanobacteria photosynthesizing outside, and these are a lot of the bacteria that live in our oceans, just kind of floating along, taking in the sun, they're really absorbing the really high energy levels of light since they're directly exposed to the sun. And until recently, scientists thought that all cyanobacteria worked that way. You just lie in the direct sunlight, absorb the light, and use it to make their own energy to survive, and then release oxygen for us to breathe. But we have C. thermalis, again, which I just told you lives within and beneath rocks in really, really cold, super dry environments. So how could something that lives inside these rocks possibly get the sunlight to survive? It turns out that this organism is capable of living on the lower energy light than its fellow cyanobacteria, allowing it to live in the rocks and still maximize what little energy it can get. So like I was saying, the ocean bacteria can kind of take in all of this light to survive, whereas these guys living in rocks take in like the tiny little bit of light that does make it through. So due to its resistance to harsh environmental conditions, especially the low temperature and low moisture, C. thermalis has actually been thought of as an organism capable of living on Mars. And scientists have kind of gone so far as to call it the terraforming bacteria, which simply means that they could maybe introduce this organism to Mars to aid in the formation of an environment that we could ultimately live in, since they produce bacteria. And since I said that Mars is about 50% farther away from the sun than Earth is, it's receiving kind of less direct sunlight. So these bacteria could potentially absorb that kind of smaller amount of energy, turn it into air that we can breathe.
Okay, so moving on to our second extreme environment, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Grand Prismatic Spring. And so its similarity to Mars is that it has extreme temperatures and extreme acidity. So it was about this time last year that I took a road trip out to Seattle with a friend of mine, and we stopped at the Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone National Park, which is the largest hot spring actually in the United States, and it's the third largest in the world. And so I thought I'd include some fun pictures that I actually took on my trip from while I was there. And so this is one of those pictures, and I know it's a little bit hard to see in the light. I'll show some more pictures that kind of distinguish it a little bit better. But what's really cool about these hot springs is that there's very distinct colors. So around the outer band here, if I can get this to work, there we go. Around the outer band here, outer band of the Grand Prismatic Spring, you can see this kind of like brighter color of pink around the outside, and then on the inner part you can kind of see a more blue-green color. And so this is a little bit better of a picture that you can kind of see it. So you can kind of see this more dramatic, so this was a pretty sign that I found highlighting it just to prove that I was there. And so you see the pink on the outer edges of it, and you see the blue-green in the middle. And so what makes these environments so unique is kind of the ecosystem that makes them up. And so all of these different colors are there because there's different microorganisms that make up different parts of this hot spring. So there's some areas of the hot spring that are hotter than others. Maybe it's right in the middle. And there's some organisms that thrive really well in these really hot environments. So if you think back to that graph I showed you before of how there's different kinds of organisms that do well in different temperatures, there's some extremophiles that do really well within the super hot parts. And then there's some organisms that might not thrive in as well of hot temperatures. Maybe they don't want it quite as hot. And so those organisms will live a little bit maybe more on the outer edges where it's not quite as hot. And so this is a really cool example of how different specialties of different organisms all kind of live together and support each other in different ways. And so of course I had to include a picture of me because I study microbes for a living. This is what I do. So this is a picture of me by the sign that says, "Do not mark bacterial mats." And so I really love this sign, A, because I study bacteria, but B, this really highlights the point of the Grand Prismatic Spring being this really special place where so many microorganisms come together to make this unique environment. So they have this sign here because they have this pathway for you to walk on, and they don't want you to walk off it and disturb the ecosystem that's so special and unique to this environment. So there's this organism called Caucus furiosus, which actually means ferocious fireball, if you denote it and look up its meaning. And it's an archaea that's classified as a hyperthermophile because of its ability to survive within extremely high temperatures. So if you remember back to this graph that I showed you before, hyperthermophiles fall on the bright side of this graph here. So they like really, really high temperatures. Back one. Yeah, so you can kind of see the picture here, maybe a little bit better. You can see that pink on the side. And so these microorganisms survive in extremely high temperatures of the hot spring. And it's also really pretty to look at, which is one of the reasons why I love it. And so kind of as Francesca highlighted before us, we really want to stress that there are these 3 domains of life, and extremophiles can fall into all 3 of these domains. So this specific microorganism falls into the archaea domain. And so here's a little bit of a better picture of, a little bit better than my iPhone camera was able to take, of the Grand Prismatic Spring, and a little bit of more of the distinction of colors that you can see from an aerial view. So you see this kind of brighter edge on the out of the pink color, a little bit of yellow, and then some more blue in the middle. And those different colors, again, are made up because of different microorganisms that comprise the environment. And so there's several unique factors about this microorganism that make it unique and allow it to survive within this kind of extreme case of an environment. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about what some of those unique factors are. So the first one is called Flagella. So if you look at this microorganism, it's kind of got all these like little pretty wavy tails on the end, and those things are called flagella. And so these things are important for a number of different reasons, 2 of which I'm going to highlight for you. First is that it allows this microorganism to have really strong motility, which means it allows it to move around really well. So you can imagine in an environment like the Grand Prismatic Spring, it's dynamic. Places that are super hot may move. Maybe it's really hot here right now, and then 2 hours later it moves a couple centimeters to the left or to the right, and it kind of dynamic, it moves around. So this microorganism has to have the ability to be able to move around and go to where it likes to best live. So when it has a bunch of these flagella on the back of it, it allows it to kind of swim and move around to where it likes best, so that when that environment moves a little bit, shifts to the right, it can also move and shift to the right. Second reason why these flagella are important is that it allows it to strongly adhere to other surfaces. And so what this means is that when it finds the environment it really likes and it decides it wants to stay there, it has all these little arms and hands that it can kind of anchor down and say, I'm going to stay right here and attach to this rock because this is where I like it. And so because it has so many of them, it allows it to kind of have a strong grip to stay put with where it is. Second super cool unique factor about this organism is that most microorganisms have to make use of whatever food sources they have available to them. And so you can imagine that if you're living in a really unique environment, like a hot spring, the organism may not have access to quite as many choices as one normally would. And so Caucus is unique in that it prefers starch to proteins for its energy source. And so this is especially helpful in these hot environments because, as you can see from the image I've depicted up here, in hot environments, proteins such as eggs tend to be unstable in hot environments. So they tend to break down a little bit more. And so you can imagine it'd be really hard for this microorganism to make use of food source if it's constantly breaking down. And so Caucus is unique in that it's able to utilize starch as its food source as opposed to protein to be able to make the energy it needs to survive. In addition, Caucus also has a very unique set of tools that allow it to function at higher temperatures, which is not the case for most organisms. So I've put up here a picture of just an example to give you a framework of mind. If you're trying to cook food on the grill or something like that, you have a unique set of tools that you use to do that, right? So you have hot gloves, you have a spatula that allows you to work with at these higher temperatures. In a similar context, Pyrococcus also has a unique set of tools, whether it be an outer framework that protects it from being degraded, or an inner framework that allows it to process the energy it needs to survive. It has a very unique set of tools that only work at these higher temperature environments that allow it to survive. Also important to note that these tools utilize a unique element which is called tungsten. And it's very rare to find this element within living organisms. And it's rare to find them within living organisms because tungsten is normally found in light bulbs. And so it's not common to find it within living organisms utilizing it for energy to survive, but Pyrococcus has made use of this element because it's present in this higher temperatures and it allows it to kind of use it as energy as a function to survive. So just to kind of summarize a little bit about Pyrococcus, so the extreme environment in which it lives is very high temperatures, so above the boiling point of water, which is 100 degrees Celsius. And it has a number of special features which I touched on, which include Flagella, its different food source, and a rather unique toolkit. And so with that, we're going to kind of pause. So now we've hit through 2 of our Extremophiles. We're going to pause for questions about those, and then we have 2 more that we're going to kind of move through. So this is the break where we can do some questions and then move on. Yeah?
You suggested that Furiosus, if it got cool,
Yeah.
the toolkit would cease to operate.
Correct.
These are not, these structures are not geologically stable. So how do they, those hot springs don't last forever.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be an influx. Do they evolve in these things? Do they evolve somewhere else more heated here? How did this happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was kind of how did Pyrococcus, right? So these environments don't always stay hot. So how did Pyrococcus end up? Were they planted in these hot places? It doesn't always stay hot forever. Do they change kind of as it goes on? And I think that's a really great question that scientists are still working to try and figure out. So it's definitely a true statement. So they're optimized to survive well at these higher temperatures. That's what they do best. So if you were to put a Pyrococcus sample in a very cold temperature, it would not survive because its unique toolkit is built to survive in these higher temperatures. So I kind of touched on the flagella a little bit, which is what is dynamic and important for its survival that allows it to move. So it allows it to move as those hot temperatures move. So like you mentioned, as the hot spring is dynamic, it's not going to always stay hot forever. Those spots may change. It may get hotter a little bit further this direction. And so that's why it has this machinery that allows it to kind of move very easily. And so I think that's one example of how it's able to kind of contest that, to be able to deal with a dynamic environment. But another true statement could be that the environment may just change, right? It may just get cold, in which case Pyrococcus is likely not going to cease, it's not going to continue to survive there. And so there's different pockets within the world that Pyrococcus live, and as I would imagine, they would continue to thrive within those temperatures that are hot and do their best to live there. But if the temperatures were to get cold, they're not really built to live within those environments. I'm not sure of that off of the top of my head. That's a great question. They might. I'm not sure. They may. There are some examples of extremophiles, which we'll touch on a little bit later, that do have mechanisms to kind of adapt to a dynamic environment. So if the environment changes, they change with it so that they can survive. And I'm not sure off the top of my head whether Pyrococcus is able to do that. Any other questions? Yeah.
I think I may have misunderstood. So the P. furiosus, does it use tungsten as its food source, or do you use it to get the starch?
Yeah, so Pyrococcus furiosus uses tungsten in its machinery. So it kind of utilizes that element that's present in the environment to make all of its machinery work, is the best way to explain it. But it's super unique because it's found in like light bulbs, not like
hot.
Yeah, which obviously gets very hot, right? Like Francesca just said. So it's super unique and very rare to find in living organisms, but it manages to like make use of this cool element because it's in such a unique environment. Good question. Yeah.
I have kind of a silly question. So you said that the different colors of the hot spring are where different types of microorganisms are living.
Yeah.
Why are they different colors? Is that due to the microorganisms, or is that due to some other aspect of
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was why the different colors of the hot spring are due to different microorganisms. And I believe it's because it's due to different byproducts of the microorganisms like producing. So like Francesca introduced the idea of like cyanobacteria and things like that. And so within the hot spring, there are different ratios of organisms that survive. And I believe it's byproducts of the organisms that kind of produce those colors. But it's really pretty to look at.
Great, okay, so we're gonna continue talking about our favorite extremophiles, but we're gonna switch gears just a little bit. So I talked about C. thermalis, a type of bacteria with a very, very specialized home under rocks in Antarctica. And Sam talked about another very, very specialized type of archaea, which lives in the really hot springs, such as in Yellowstone. So that's kind of one way to become a super extremophile. You adapt to a single, highly specific environment so well that no one else can possibly live there too, and that's what the last two organisms did. But another way to develop an extremely tough skin is to be able to live everywhere, and I mean everywhere. So the next organism we're going to talk about is Dyna Radiodurans, and it's a type of bacterium that has been found in soil, feces, meat, sewage, dried foods, room dust, medical instruments, and textiles. So Dyna Radiodurans was discovered in 1956 at the Oregon Agricultural Experiment Station in Corvallis, Oregon. And scientists were performing experiments to try to determine whether they could zap cans of meat with a ton of radiation they thought was enough to kill any living organism and kind of make sure that that meat wouldn't spoil and people wouldn't get food poisoning. So they used a tin of meat, they exposed it to a huge, massive dose of radiation, and a few hours later, the meat went bad, and they isolated one type of bacterium, and that was Dyna Radiodurans. So the similarity to Mars that we're going to be touching on here is just extreme temperatures, radiation, dryness, you name it, Dyna can probably survive it. So as we were touching on with the different domains of life, this is a type of bacteria. And Dyna Radiodurans, like I said, is very special. It can survive extreme temperatures, it can survive dehydration, it can survive radiation, acidity, all sorts of things, making it known as a polyextremophile. That just means it can survive all sorts of extreme environments. And because of this, Dyna was actually listed as the world's toughest bacterium in the Guinness Book of World Records and continues to hold this record to this day. So, like I said, one of the more unique things about Dyna is that it is able to withstand extremely, extremely acute doses of radiation that would literally obliterate anything else in its way. So this here is just a plot showing percent survival. So it's just cells like ourselves, our own cells, and other bacteria. And the x-axis just shows radiation, and Grace is just one of the units of radiation. So if you zoom in, you actually have to zoom in to see how much humans can survive. You'll see that 100% of humans would die if they were exposed to 10 grays of radiation. Meanwhile, E. coli, which is your kind of run-of-the-mill bacteria, can survive about 200 to 600 grays. The tardigrade, which was mentioned earlier in the discussion and Sam's going to talk about next, can survive up to about 5,000 grays. And Dyna right here, you can see even as high as 15,000 grays of radiation, it can still, probably 40% of it can survive. So it's kind of insane. So kind of to begin to better understand how these bacteria are able to survive in such high doses of radiation, and this is, I just want to say, this is a very active area of interest, and this is kind of the minimal amount of information that we currently understand. We first need to talk a little bit about genomes. So your genome, that's just a word to describe the complete set of DNA or genetic material in your bodies. And it's kind of like a really detailed book with the instructions on how to make a human, in your case. So all of the cells that make up your body contain a single copy of your genome, which kind of tells each cell what to make, how to work, what to do in order to keep you alive and healthy. And what's fascinating is that while we have, and most organisms just have one copy of their genome in their cells, Caucus has as many as 10, and they're all just kind of stacked together in this really compact structure. So when radiation strikes, it directly hurts our DNA. It physically interacts with it and tries to break it up. And all organisms, or most organisms at least, have toolkits that help them fix these minor breaks, like little sewing kits that kind of stitch together broken pieces to make them work again. But when a lot of radiation strikes and a ton of our DNA is damaged all at once in really high doses of radiation, our toolkits are just not equipped to properly, reliably fix our cells. But Caucus, because it has so many copies of its genome stacked on top of each other, when all this radiation strikes, some of the DNA remains undamaged, especially because the radiation can't fully penetrate all of it, and there's just so many copies that the likelihood of all of it getting obliterated is actually not as high. And so this DNA is then used to help fix everything, which is kind of how Caucus can survive much higher doses of radiation. So there's a lot of biology that we still don't understand about this particular bacterium, but that was kind of the coolest part, in my opinion. And so, as we can see, you can have organisms that survive in really specialized environments and also ones that can survive absolutely anywhere. And so the extreme environment I talked about with Caucus is kind of anything extreme, but it's best known in the Guinness World Records for its radiation resistance. And its special features include that it has multiple copies of its genome and just a more sophisticated toolkit to fix any damage.
Okay, so coming to my favorite part of the talk, the tardigrade. So before we get there, I want to kind of set up here and for us to kind of take a second to think, right? So we've heard about 3 really cool extremophiles that live in like very different areas of extreme environments. And I want you to think about not only what those extremophiles were, but what tools they had and what extreme environments we said that it was that they could live in. And so if you remember, we talked about organisms that could live in the hot temperatures of the hot springs, or there's organisms that can live in the hydrothermal sea vents, so at the very bottom of the ocean. There's organisms that can live in wet environments in and around water, and also in the dry and cold of Antarctica. And so similarity to Mars comes in a number of different places. So this could be extreme temperatures, this could be radiation, could be dryness. And so as we get closer to trying to find an organism that can survive on Mars, I want you to try and think if you can imagine an organism that was not only built to survive in just one of these extreme environments, but all of them. And so these resistance features can actually be found in naturally occurring animals as well. And so coming back to the 3 domains of life that we initially presented in the beginning, the next organism I'm going to talk about falls in this eukarya domain. And it's important to remember that we also fall in this eukarya domain. So the organism I'm about to talk about fall in the same. It's a small animal. And this organism is the tardigrade, which is also known as water bear or moss piglet, which is my favorite synonym for its name. And these tardigrades have been known to survive extreme temperatures, both high and low, extreme pressures, both high and low, air deprivation, radiation, dehydration, and starvation. And these are 8-legged little animals that you can see in the little picture right over here. This is what they look like. These are tardigrades. And they are also, similar to Caucus, polyextremophiles, meaning that they can live in a number of different extreme environments, not just one. And so putting into context how big these little organisms are, right? Because I said animal. When you think of animal, you're like, okay, great, like a moose hopping around, or a pig, or a cow, right? But just to put up a little picture of our ruler here, so if we're looking at a centimeter on a scale of a ruler, and then a millimeter, these little tardigrades fall in about the size of a millimeter. So the small little 1/10 of a centimeter. And to put this into even better context for you, this is about the size, next one, this is about the size that a dime would fall. So you would imagine you can fit about 19 to 20 tardigrades across the span of a dime, which is very, very tiny. So these creatures are incredibly small, which is even more fascinating for some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So just because I have to one-up Francesca's Guinness Book of World Records, I thought I'd put some of the headlines that are in the news about water bears. So water bears are the first animal to survive space vacuum, which I'll talk about. Secrets of the water bear, the only animal that can survive in space. These animals can survive until the end of the Earth, astrophysicists say. How does the tiny water bear survive in outer space? And tardigrades, water bears in space. So the question becomes, do these organisms have what it takes to survive on Mars? So we're first going to talk and learn a little bit more about some of the machinery that makes them so special. So the first component to this machinery, tardigrades have an incredibly strong outer shell. So this strong outer shell allows them to survive within numerous extreme environments. So one example of these extreme environments could be extreme temperatures. They can survive low temperatures up to negative 300 degrees Fahrenheit or up to positive or above 300 degrees Fahrenheit. They can survive pressures that are about 6,000 times that of the atmosphere we experience. So Francesca showed a slide earlier that said our normal sea level pressure is about 14 psi, which is the measurement of pressure. They can survive about 6,000 times that, so over 6,000 psi. Although tardigrades cannot beat Dyna Caucus on the radiation measurement, they are still pretty incredible in what levels of radiation they're able to survive. So they can survive radiation doses that are about 1,000 times what would be fatal for humans, although again, not quite as high as Dyna Caucus. So the next pretty incredible thing about tardigrades is this state that they're able to go in that's called cryptobiosis. And so what happens in this state of cryptobiosis is that the tardigrades lose all but 3% of the water in their bodies. So they essentially dehydrate themselves so that there's not a lot of water within them. This puts them in a state that's called a ton, which is where they create a gel around themselves that is built to specialize and protect them around whatever extreme environment they're in. And so, for example, if the temperature of the tardigrade's environment starts to fall below freezing and get really cold, the tardigrade is able to form a special cold-resistant ton or a cold-resistant coating in which the molecules within that coating prevent the formation of ice crystals. So this is important because if it freezes in ice crystals form, it will damage the cell membranes in the cells and likely cause the tardigrade to die. But it creates this special coat around itself to keep it from freezing and forming those ice crystals, but still allow it to survive. So this is kind of what it looks like in that ton state. If you imagine from the picture before, it kind of shrivels up and gets really like close and dehydrated, and it stays in this condition until conditions around it are a little bit better, in which case it will then continue to grow and replicate. So another super cool aspect of the tardigrades is their metabolism, which I know sounds like a super scary word, and it's like, oh my goodness, I don't know what that means. To break it down, metabolism essentially means, so us as all living organisms, we have to consume some sort of food source, process it to make energy, and use that energy to survive. That's essentially what metabolism is talking about. That process of taking in some sort of a food source, processing it for energy, and using that energy to do the normal things that we have to do. So tardigrades have an exceptional way of utilizing and using their metabolism depending on what environment they're in. So for an example, if a tardigrade is in a context of, let's say, a water area, an area where there's a lot of water and there tends to be not a lot of oxygen, the tardigrade needs oxygen to survive, similar to we do, how we need it to breathe. So instead of shriveling up and going into that ton state, instead what the tardigrade does, since it needs oxygen to survive, is it will stretch out into kind of this super long relaxed state that you can kind of see here. So as opposed to the ton before where it's all kind of curled up, you can see it kind of spreads out here and it relaxes all of its muscles, and this allows the tardigrade to kind of soak up as much oxygen and water as possible into their cells. So it's spreading its surface area out so that more of its cells can take up the nearby water and oxygen and continue to allow it to survive. So this is just one example of when the oxygen levels are lower, how it's able to survive in that environment, but it has other ways of doing this too in other kinds of metabolic environments. Okay, so moving on. So the space study that I mentioned. So there was a group of European researchers that decided, wow, tardigrades are pretty cool, and I would have to agree, and whether or not they can survive in space. So can they actually be put to this test? And so these group of European researchers took a sample of tardigrades and they dehydrated them into that ton state where they're kind of all shriveled up and curled together. And they took them up into the International Space Station, so up out in orbit above the Earth's atmosphere. And when they were up in that International Space Station, they rehydrated them so that they would come back to growing and living and moving around. Several of them laid eggs. The eggs hatched. They continued to survive, and then they took them back down into Earth's atmosphere, and they continued to survive, lay more eggs, and grow and replicate. So this was kind of a really cool example of a study that was really the first one where they were able to take these living organisms up into space, have them grow, continue to replicate, and then take them back down and have them continue to do the same thing. So this was just a very preliminary study. They were very excited by it, and so there's a lot more research going into this kind of field and seeing whether tardigrades can survive in more extreme environments in other areas of space, which I know was touched on before. So I think there's a lot of promise in this area for the tardigrades. And so to kind of summarize a little bit about these extreme environments that tardigrades can live in, which is pretty much everything from what I was reading. So we've got temperatures, hot and cold, pressures, hot and cold, different areas of water, radiation, different kinds of soil, and potentially space. So some of their special features include their strong outer shell, this ton state that they can go in, and also their metabolism, so their ability to utilize whatever kind of environment they're in to be able to make use of what they have present. And so that's our last two microorganisms extremophile examples that we're going to kind of go through. So we're going to pause here for questions before we move on to the last little chunk of our talk. So are there any questions about the last two organisms? Yeah?
Is there any of these extraordinary organisms represent a risk for the humans? Because maybe, I don't know, if it's resistant to the acidity, and maybe we can eat it and it will leave the stomach acid, even if there is a stomach acid. Or is something that is any of these dangerous for the human being?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The question was whether any of these organisms that can kind of survive in any sort of environment could pose a risk to humans. And so no one's actually really kind of exposed themselves to these organisms to know for sure, but my guess would be no, because these organisms evolved for a long time in environments that have no humans whatsoever. And so the kind of way that they would be able to pose a threat would be if they were able to produce like a toxin or something that would directly sicken the human. And my guess is that if they saw a human right now, they would just be like, okay, cool, like I'll try to live here, maybe not. Maybe our own immune systems would be able to find them and be like, oh, you're a foreign organism, let me get rid of you. So I don't think that's my guess, is that it wouldn't be a major issue, but it's definitely something that people would have to look into before, sending us off on a spaceship to Mars along with just these organisms to see what happens.
There's so many species of microorganisms, and there's only a very, very small number of them that actually pose the risk to humans. And those are the ones we hear about and think about the most, but as Francesca said, most bacteria really don't want to make us sick. They're just really happy hanging out in there
why this organism, where did they come?
So the question is, where did these organisms come from? That is a great question. The short answer is we have no idea. The speculations are, okay, when, Earth was in its beginnings, it was extremely hot, extremely crazy, being bombarded by asteroids and things like that. And so people speculate that, for instance, like the early signs of life that were able to survive there had to be forms of life that could withstand these extreme environments. The other idea is that because evolution has just gone on for billions and billions of years, as Earth kind of got all of these crazy environments, life just kind of wanted to happen. And so where there was a pocket for something over really, really long periods of time to evolve to be able to survive there, it eventually found a way. And the time scale is something that we cannot possibly comprehend because it's so long, but that's kind of what people speculate. Then there's also the hypothesis that, maybe these organisms did come from, space, like the tardigrades, that, maybe an asteroid came to Earth from somewhere and the tardigrades were there. Like, we have no idea. And that's definitely a very active area of interest. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to add, so all forms of life experience competition, right? So everything wants to grow and replicate and continue to survive. So the benefit that extremophiles have is that not many organisms live within these extreme environments. So if an organism can figure out a way to live at 100 degrees Celsius, it's not going to have any competition. It can grow and survive there because everything else is going to die. And so from an evolutionary perspective, it's to its benefit to figure out if it can evolve in a way that allows it to survive. It doesn't have to face as much competition. And so that's another area of hypothesis that exists for why these kind of came up. Yeah?
That's good for the others. The tardigrades, you can get them in a moss-covered rock.
Yeah.
And that tongue, is there any evidence, any knowledge that we have of how old that lineage is?
Yeah, I actually forgot to mention it. So it's like a crazy, I got really lost one night and sent Francesca a string of emails. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this. These things are crazy. There's evidence that they survived during the time of the dinosaurs, and they've survived several mass extinction populations. Have been around for some in the order of billions of years. But I don't think there's any real number speculation that I can think of off the top of my head of really where they originated or where they came from. But it's a huge question, right? Because they're able to survive. Yeah, very true. Very true.
They're like microscopic cockroaches.
Yeah, they really are. Kayla? They are pretty.
I was going to ask kind of a related question, which is the species has been around for millions of years, but an individual tardigrade, how long do they live? Are they able to live for?
Yeah, so there's different spans. So I think the average lifespan is somewhere in the order of months to 2 years. But when they're in that ton state that's dehydrated, it's on the order of hundreds of years. But I don't know the study off the top of my head that did that. But the ton state allows them to survive much longer. But a normal, actively producing in a happy environment tardigrade, I think its lifespan is ballpark 2-ish years.
Has anybody tried people measure fossils' age?
Mm-hmm.
Do they try to do that with tardigrades?
Do you want to answer? Okay, yeah, that's a great question, right? So to figure out how long and how old they've been, I don't know if anybody's done that. That's a really good question. I imagine that they did some sort of a speculation for that. So when they were testing, if they imagine they've been around the time of the dinosaurs, they must have done some sort of a testing to see if they were around. Maybe they found them in fossils or something like that. But I don't actually know if they've tested how old they've gone. My guess would be that speculation comes from they found them in fossils and samples of them from there. But that's a great question.
Are they living in fossils?
Yeah, I think they've found them in fossils that have been present with the dinosaurs, but I'm not super familiar with with that like research that they've done. But I believe there is research that's happening in that area because it's super crazy, right?
Yeah, like, was there like a different, like kind of like a subspecies maybe that was before it, but then it kind of evolved from it?
That could totally be the case. So the question was there like a subspecies maybe at the time of the dinosaurs that's evolved? I think that definitely could be the case with the tardigrades. But I don't, yeah.
I was just going to say that would be a really cool study because there are people whose job is to go through the fossil record, and they do it with bacteria, right? They'll dig up, mummies or dinosaurs and like dinosaur teeth and kind of see what these bacteria were, and then they can kind of sequence them and study them and compare them to the bacteria that we have today. I think with tardigrades, it might be a teeny bit more difficult because they're a little bit more complicated than bacteria since they're multiple cells, like Sam was saying, they're a bit bigger. But I think that would be a really cool study to kind of see where they were and kind of where they were throughout the fossil record. So if there aren't any more questions, we figured right now would be a great time to kind of put the Extremophiles to the test. So just kind of as a recap, these are the 4 organisms that we talked about. So you have C. thermalis, Pyrrhocaucus, D. Radiodurans, tardigrades, and kind of we have a poll set up, which we'll show you on the next slide. So we're hoping if everyone wants to take their phones out and kind of cast a vote. So these are the instructions. So you can either go on your browser to this link up here, or if you want to send a text message, you can text, sorry, my name's long. You can text Francesca Tom 705, that text to the number 22333 to join the session. And then your answer options are up here. So the question is, which of these organisms do you think is the best fit for Mars? So your options are the ones we talked about, all of them, or none of them. And we're going to pull up the poll.
We'll give it a few minutes for everyone to do it. And then I have the link pulled up so we can look at it.
And if anyone's having trouble, let us know, and we can go the old-fashioned way with a show of hands.
So A is C. thermalis, B is Pyrrhocaucus furiosus, D is Deinocaucus radiodurans, D is tardigrade, and then E is they all seem great. I can't pick just one. F is none of them. Mars is still too harsh of an environment.
Do we want to show the results live or give it a little bit?
No, I think we should give it.
Don't want bias.
I knew it.
I know. Surprise, I was thinking, okay, there we go.
It's working. We'll give it a minute or two and then I'll post them.
Yeah.
So you were talking about the radiation levels and like how quickly humans would die.
Here.
And, maybe I missed it, and how quickly the radiodurans would die. What's the radiation level on Mars?
Yeah, so the radiation level on Mars was, we had a slide about it. Let me see if I can find it.
Because I think maybe
It's a lot lower than the...
slip because
Yeah, so, I had to switch up the units a little bit, but the radiation on Earth, this is just per year, would be 0.0062 grays, and on Mars it would be 0.2 grays per year, and that's just an average, so there's some days where you could experience a lot more or a lot less. So these numbers that you're seeing, that these things can withstand, and really active question is, how could they possibly have evolved to withstand such high levels of radiation when we never see such high levels in nature? And no one knows the answer, but there are some hypotheses. And one of them is, the effects of radiation could be very similar to the effects of extreme dryness or anything that will really just damage your DNA and your inner workings. And so a lot of people think that resistance to radiation could actually just kind of be the happy consequence of something that evolved to survive extreme dryness. But yeah, it's a really good point to realize that these numbers are far above, what Mars has.
again,
Can we go back to the slide?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Which slide was this?
Last slide, but looking at
The
it,
poll.
like, if a human would die at like 20 grays, and Mars gets 0.2 grays a year, you'd be fine from the radiation perspective on Mars.
So yeah, so the per year thing, so that's like kind of a cumulative dosage. So in the sense that over years and years, if you're getting, 2 rads per year, something like that, over time the effects add up. So it's kind of like, I guess on Earth the comparison is when you get tans or like just lie out in the sun for a really long time. If you do it once or twice, you get a sunburn, usually, you're fine. But if you do it over and over again, over time, that can turn into skin cancer. So I think it's kind of like that kind of comparison where it's just a higher risk because you're being exposed to a higher baseline of radiation. And then if you're living there for a very, very long time, the effects kind of tend to add up kind of more quickly than they would on Earth. Yeah.
You said that also the tardigrade had a good amount of defense against radiation. Would that also be enough to hold up in like what Mars has?
Yeah, do you want to handle that?
Tardigrade?
Yeah, a tardigrade question.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question, and we're gonna actually show some examples. I'll pull it up in 1 second. We're gonna show some examples of this when we go to our lab tour of how we kind of do this artificially in the lab, how we're able to kind of ask these questions, right? Because some of these radiation levels don't occur naturally on Earth, and so how do we even begin to test them? So we're gonna show you some examples of how we do that. The honest answer is I just think we don't know. Like they've not actually taken them to Mars yet. They've taken them up into the International Space Station, which from my understanding is just like in the orbit outside of Earth. But I think the question is, that's a great question to figure out, yeah. Okay, so I will pull up, can you hold this for a second? I'll pull up our results. So these are the results of our survey.
Looks like we have a winner.
Which is awesome, though. There's some more spread than I thought there was going to be, which I think is cool. Do you want to talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's great that, no one seems to think that none of them would survive, which I think is really cool. So it sounds like we've convinced you that something could actually survive on Mars. Please don't hold us to it if people actually try, because this is, just speculation. But yeah, it looks like the tardigrade or the water bear is a clear winner, which is also really interesting because that's kind of all the organisms we talked about, that's probably the one that's most closely related to us since it's within our domain of life as opposed to the other bacteria. If anyone wants to, volunteer why they picked the one that they picked, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Does anyone want to defend their choice?
I guess mine was just wishful thinking because the thermalis makes oxygen.
Yeah.
So
There's been studies on that, haven't there?
Yeah, I think people have really thought like that would be really cool to have this organism that looks like it could survive there, but then could also give us something back.
Right.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Okay, I will click back to here. Thank you guys for participating in that poll. We like to kind of make it a little more interactive and dynamic. So the honest answer to this is that there is no right answer, right? So all of these organisms have different components that would make them really feasible to live in an environment like Mars, right? And so we talked a little bit on each one about the unique tools that it has and the special features that would make it good to live on Mars, but the end game is that there is not just one, right? All of them have a little bit of something that would kind of help to contribute to them living on Mars, but it might not necessarily be just one organism has it all. And so thank you for your participation in that. I think that that's a really cool way to kind of, like we talked about a little bit, right? So each one can contribute something different. And I think that's a really cool picture to kind of paint in your mind when thinking about all of this. And just to kind of wrap up a little bit with a picture of an iceberg here. So we gave you 4 examples of extremophiles tonight, but there are thousands of examples of extremophiles. And so I think it's really important to just put in perspective after hearing all this cool information and all these cool toolkits that these organisms have, to just kind of take a step back and realize that there are so many more organisms out there that do so many other cool things. So really in the greater picture of trying to ask whether or not life can live on Mars, we've really tonight, just in the hour and a half that we've been here, really just scratched on the surface of answering this question. And so with that, Francesca and I want to put a big thank you to a lot of different groups for making this available and giving us the chance to kind of talk here tonight. We were really excited to put together, and thank you guys for coming out. And if there's any more final questions before the lab tour, we are happy to answer them. But thank you guys for coming out.